No real army stood behind that map anymore. Only pins, only names. In the summer of 1944, after Operation Bagration, the reports arriving in Berlin carried impossible numbers. Entire divisions reduced to remnants. Tanks and artillery almost erased. Hundreds of thousands of men killed, wounded, or captured in just a few weeks. How could anyone still talk about reserves when what remained at the front were exhausted marching groups with no fuel, no heavy artillery, and no functioning railway lines to support them? On the wall, Army Group Center still appeared as a continuous line, a central defensive system shielding the heart of the Reich. On paper, it looked damaged but repairable. The reality behind those colored symbols was different. In Belarus, between June and early July, Soviet armies had broken through the German lines, encircled major formations, and overran key cities like Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk and Minsk. Many of the divisions that still had neatly printed designations on situation maps had ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. Some were down to a few hundred men. Others existed only as scattered groups trying to reach the west on foot. In Berlin, and at forward headquarters, the staff officers who compiled the daily situation reports began to see the pattern. Lost reports came in from corps and armies. Messages from surviving command posts mentioned phrases like remnants, fragments, and mixed battle groups instead of regiments and divisions. The numbers did not add up to the reassuring picture that the wall maps suggested. Yet every morning, the maps were carefully updated, lines adjusted a few centimeters to the west, new markers inserted to represent reconstructed divisions that, for the moment, lived only in orders and in the imagination of the High Command. At the center of this shrinking world stood Adolf Hitler, still alive, still convinced that willpower and orders could reverse any setback. After the shock of Bagration, he demanded plans to stabilize the front and to prepare a counterstroke. The staff had to show him that there would be reserves to rebuild a defensive line east of Warsaw, to seal the gaps in front of East Prussia, to protect the approaches to the Vistula River. On paper, the answer could always be yes. New divisions could be formed by renaming shattered units, combining survivors from multiple regiments, and transferring designations from the west or from the replacement army. But the paper solution did not create real soldiers, tanks, or ammunition. Behind each new symbol placed on the map, a staff officer who knew the uncomfortable truth. One reconstituted infantry division had consist of a few thousand men with light weapons, lacking heavy artillery, lacking transport, lacking experienced officers. Another division might be nothing more than a skeleton staff, and some hastily assembled rear area troops, still waiting for weapons that Germany could no longer produce or deliver in sufficient quantity. The gap between the map and the reality at the front grew wider with every day that passed. The destruction of Army Group Center was more than a local crisis. It ruptured the entire German defensive system in the east. In less than a month, the German army lost around a quarter of its manpower on that front, with roughly 25 to 28 divisions effectively wiped out and hundreds of thousands of men lost. Many of these units had been the backbone of the central sector since the early years of the war. Their officers knew the terrain, the rail lines, the river crossings, and the Soviet tactics. When they disappeared, they could not be replaced by formations scraped together from training depots and convalescent centers. This is where the story of no army left becomes a story of numbers, logistics, and industrial limits. To rebuild a destroyed army group, Germany would have needed not only men, but also rifles, machine guns, artillery, anti-tank weapons, radios, trucks, horses, fuel, and ammunition on a massive scale. By mid-1944, German industry was under heavy pressure from Allied bombing, losing access to oil sources and struggling to keep up even with existing demands. Every tank, every railway engine, every ton of fuel was already committed to other fronts or to trying to hold the rapidly collapsing lines. At the same time, the Soviet Union now had an enormous logistical backbone supported in part by its own industrial recovery east of the Urals, and in part by American and Allied supplies delivered through Lend-Lease. Trains brought not only Soviet-made tanks and guns to the front, but also American trucks, locomotives, and locomotion fuel that expanded the Red Army's operational reach. This meant that when Army Group Center collapsed, the Soviet forces advancing into Belarus were not outrunning their supply system, as they had in 1941. They were supported by a more robust logistical network that could sustain deep operations. From the German point of view, this created a bitter contrast. On their maps, they still imagined lines of resistance and counterattack. In reality, their own supply columns were short of fuel, their locomotives were destroyed or immobilized, and partisan activity had wrecked rail junctions and bridges just before the Soviet offensive began. When they tried to move remaining units into position to form a new line, they often found that the rails were cut, the roads blocked, or the fuel allocation insufficient to move more than a fraction of what the orders demanded. Within the high command, different men reacted to this crisis in different ways. Some staff officers tried to be as honest as possible in their reports, stressing that certain divisions were no longer combat effective or temporarily unfit for offensive operations. Others chose language that softened the blow, hoping to avoid Hitler's anger or to buy time for some kind of reorganization. The result was a language of euphemisms, where a division that had been virtually destroyed could still be described as holding its positions with weakened battalions. Hitler, reading these reports and listening to oral briefings, pushed for plans that assumed the existence of reserves that his own documents quietly denied. He ordered divisions to be detached from quieter sectors, to be moved by rail to plug the gap in the center. He demanded that commanders on the spot restore the situation and prepare local counterattacks. But each of these plans ran into the same wall. The units on which they relied were either already destroyed, locked in desperate defensive fighting elsewhere, or physically incapable of reaching the required sectors in time. The reconstruction of Army Group Center quickly turned into a bureaucratic exercise. New headquarters were appointed. A renowned fireman, Field Marshal Walter Model, was sent to take command and stabilize the front. Under him, the remnants of shattered divisions were reorganized, assigned new sector boundaries, and given new names. Yet even Model, known for extracting the last possible strength from exhausted troops, could not conjure up artillery pieces, tanks, and trained infantry that simply did not exist. In internal studies and later analyses, German officers admitted that the disaster in the summer of 1944 marked a point of no return. One post-war assessment described the losses as far worse than those suffered at Stalingrad, Tunis, or in the Falaise Pocket, because they hollowed out the central structure of the Eastern Front and removed experienced cadres that had been the core of German combat power. Another historian would later argue that after Bagration, Germany could no longer conduct large-scale strategic offensives in the East. It could only delay the inevitable. What made this moment particularly striking for the enemy's perception was the contrast between Germany's inability to rebuild and the sheer scale of Allied industrial power. While Germany struggled to equip a handful of reconstituted divisions, the United States and Britain were still launching new armies into Western Europe, supplying them with endless convoys of trucks, tanks, and aircraft. American factories continued to deliver aircraft, vehicles, and ammunition, not only for their own forces, but also for their allies. The men in German headquarters knew, from intelligence and from observation, that their opponents had resources on a scale they could no longer hope to match. On the Eastern Front, this asymmetry also showed up in the way Soviet forces could replace losses and continue attacking. After Bagration, Soviet armies paused mainly to realign, regroup, and bring up fresh supplies, not because they lacked reserves altogether. Their forward units received replacement tanks and guns, often transported on robust fleets of American-built trucks and locomotives. German soldiers and officers who saw this in the field or in captured material understood that the industrial and logistical balance of the war had shifted decisively. Inside the conference rooms, where Hitler met with his generals, maps and reports competed for his attention. On one side, situation maps displayed a new line anchored on the Vistula and the Baltic states, with symbols that suggested a stable, continuous front. On the other, casualty reports and production figures, often held in the hands of more sober planners, hinted that any new line would be thinner, weaker, and less sustainable than the last. Those who tried to point this out faced the risk of being dismissed, sidelined, or worse. In some testimonies and analyses, the summer of 1944 emerges as the period when the German army, as an instrument capable of controlling events in the East, effectively collapsed. It would continue to fight, to inflict and suffer heavy losses, and to execute local maneuvers. But the concept of a fully equipped, fully manned army group in the center, able to launch major counteroffensives or to hold a long-prepared front, was gone. Army Group Center could be redrawn and renamed, but the original formation that had marched into the Soviet Union in 1941 no longer existed. For the men who handled the daily paperwork, the weight of this realization grew heavier. They filled in tables, updated charts, and drafted orders to create new divisions on paper, knowing that finding the men, officers, and weapons to make them real would be close to impossible. In that sense, the story of this period is also a story of a bureaucracy trying to maintain the appearance of order as the material basis of its authority disintegrated. From a distance, the Allied public would mainly hear about great offensives, liberated cities, and changing front lines. The deeper reality inside German headquarters was quieter and more technical. Shifts in columns of numbers, shortages noted in supply summaries, and increasingly desperate attempts to spread to little strength over to longer front. The language remained formal and precise, but behind each phrase lay a simple fact. There was no longer an army behind many of the symbols drawn on the map. That is why this moment matters so much in the larger story of the war. Operation Bagration was not just a Soviet victory on the battlefield. It was the event that broke the spine of Germany's central front and exposed the limits of its manpower, logistics, and industry. After it, the path to Berlin was not yet open, but the capacity to stop that path from being opened had been fatally weakened. The illusion of reserves, of a hidden strength that could still be thrown into battle, could no longer be sustained in the face of the documents lying on the tables in Berlin. No real army stood behind that map anymore. Only pins, only names. And in the quiet moments between conferences and briefings, more than one officer must have understood that no matter how many times the maps were redrawn, the resources needed to rebuild what had been lost simply did not exist. The enemy had reached a level of logistical and industrial power that could replace entire formations faster than Germany could reconstruct even a fraction of its losses. That imbalance, recorded line by line in German reports, turned the collapse of Army Group Center from a military defeat into a point of no return. If you want to keep exploring these hidden turning points of the war, where the real decisions are buried in reports, numbers, and forgotten maps, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and write in the comments where you are watching from. That support helps Deep History continue bringing documentaries based on real historical archives to the screen.